Odds are, if you've heard of The Legend of Zelda, you've heard of Shigeru Miyamoto. If you know whose boyhood adventures inspired the series, then you've heard his name. We are not here to talk about Shigeru Miyamoto. If you've heard of The Legend of Zelda, you've heard of Eiji Aonuma. If you've ever cursed the Water Temple or fell in love with Breath of the Wild, then you've heard his name. But we are not here to talk about Eiji Aonuma. If you've ever played any number of critically acclaimed 3D Mario games, you're probably aware of this man. This is Yoshiaki Koizumi, well known for his work on the beloved Mario franchise. If you've not heard his name, well, we are here to talk about Yoshiaki Koizumi and how he, with little attention or fanfare, changed this little fantasy adventure series forever. A new Zelda game was never intended to be made for the Game Boy. Instead, developers at Nintendo were trying to decide if a port of A Link to the Past could run on that little handheld. But what had started out as tinkering to test the Game Boy's capabilities quickly became what Takashi Tezuka described as an after-school club activity, with many putting in a full day's work on other projects, then working on this game outside of normal hours. The A Link to the Past port was eventually abandoned, and the game morphed into what felt like a parody of The Legend of Zelda, including characters from all sorts of other Nintendo series. As Tezuka put it, it was for the Game Boy, so we thought, oh, it'll be fine. With a new Zelda now officially being developed, the team grew to include not only Tezuka and A Link to the Past's lead programmer Kazuaki Morita, but other veterans of the SNES classic. Story writer Kensuke Tanabe and illustrator, you guessed it, Yoshiaki Koizumi. Strangely, surreally, the freewheeling, unrestrained development of what would become Link's Awakening vaulted Koizumi into the role of main story writer. As Tezuka recalls, it looked like he'd be good at creating a story, so we lured him into our after-school club. Koizumi-san was in charge of the opening movie and main story. He's a romantic, and I think that shows in The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. He was in charge of the whole flow of the story. Inspired by the American show Twin Peaks, Tezuka provided guardrails for Koizumi to craft his story. No Zelda, no Triforce, no Hyrule, and instead a small scope, suspicious characters, and deep and distinctive characteristics. Incidentally, one of the most iconic images associated with Link's Awakening, the egg perched atop the mountain peak, was in fact a holdover idea from Tanabe. With Miyamoto busy on other projects, the development team had free rein to focus Link's Awakening on this small cast of characters, filling the adventure with engaging side events and subplots. With the perspective that video games were an effective vehicle for engaging storytelling, Koizumi aimed to infuse this new Zelda with drama. Link's Awakening was released in 1993, and it is often credited as the first Zelda game to tell a proper story. It wasn't until The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening that the series started having a proper plot. The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past had a bit of a story, but a story running throughout the whole game really started with The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. That must mean Koizumi-san, the romantic, who is in charge of the story, had quite a large influence over the general direction of the Legend of Zelda series. Koizumi would later recall, "The first real game work that I did was on Link's Awakening, but at the same time, I came in to write the manual, as I did on the previous game, but they had nothing in place. So I ended up making an entire story to go along with the game. The dream, the island, that was all mine. And so that was my first experience doing the kind of work that we would now call event design. But there were not too many people at the time with expertise in that area, so I really had free rein to do what I wanted, so long as I didn't make Miyamoto angry." A new Zelda game was always intended to follow Ocarina of Time, just not the one it became. After the release of Ocarina of Time, there were plans to create redesigned dungeons in a Master Quest, then known as Ura Zelda, for the Japan-exclusive 64DD. Feeling that Ocarina's dungeons were already the best they could be, Eiji Aonuma, while agreeing to do it, was not too keen on Miyamoto's suggestion to make a new game out of these remixed dungeons. Instead, Aonuma began making new dungeons in secret, an exercise he found much more enticing, and eventually worked up the courage to ask Miyamoto if, instead of a Master Quest, he could create a new Zelda game. As is now deeply baked into Zelda development lore, Miyamoto agreed, on the condition that the game be made in 1 year. Elsewhere, Koizumi was working on a Cops and Robbers board game that was to be replayed over the same 1-week period. When that game was cancelled, Miyamoto assigned Koizumi to Aonuma's now-in-development Zelda game. The days were whittled down from a week's worth to 3, and Majora's Mask, then known as Zelda Gaiden, had its gameplay hook, achieving Miyamoto's vision of creating a compact entry in the Zelda series that could be replayed over and over, revealing greater depth with each playthrough. While Aonuma worked to create the fairy tale elements of Majora's Mask, many of the game's darker, realistic elements came from Koizumi, who was placed in charge of scripting the events of the characters of Clocktown, striving to depict their lives as realistically as possible. Additionally, and perhaps inspired by Link's Awakening, Majora's Mask's iconic image of the moon falling came to Koizumi in a daydream. Occasionally, I also take images from dreams. So if I could just give an example of one of those idle daydreams that turns into an idea for a game, I would look up at the moon and think about what would happen if the moon started to fall towards Earth. From that idea, we moved onto the world in Majora's Mask, which is threatened by being destroyed by the moon. Many of the franchise's most memorable character moments, like protecting Romani Ranch, restoring Pamela's father, and reuniting Anju and Cafe, all sprang from the creative mind of Koizumi, and served to make the world of Termina come to life. Released in 2000, Majora's Mask, though often considered an outlier, is too considered one of the Zelda franchise's best, for its confident, darker tone, expert balance of character and story, and sometimes in spite of its controversial time mechanic. Art can take many forms, hold many purposes, and while good art may give answers, the best art asks questions. Prior to Koizumi's involvement, the Zelda franchise consisted of 3 games that were meant to be fun and exciting, but didn't ask much of the player beyond honing their in-game prowess and indulging their curiosity to explore. But Yoshiaki Koizumi's influence on the series elevated Zelda from a mere video game into a legitimate and authentic form of art. Nowhere has this been better implemented than the surreal shores of Koholint and the dreary dream world of Termina. Both began in the unenviable position of having to follow up the critically acclaimed successes of A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, juggernauts of world-building, atmosphere, and game design in their own right. Instead of doubling down on their bombastic, epic tone, Link's Awakening and Majora's Mask went small, forced Link and us, the player, to look inward, made us fall in love with a small host of characters, asked us to confront grief and loss, memory and time, to reflect on the scene on the lid of a sleeper's eye, to meditate on the terrible fate we've met in our own ways. I understand that game development is not a solo act, but during his time at Nintendo, and perhaps on greatest display during his work on the Legend of Zelda series, Yoshiaki Koizumi has consistently and reliably provided creative, unique, and in some instances, paradigm-shifting video game experiences. In this video, I focused on his impact on Zelda's story, but I want to take a quick moment to praise his other creative pursuits particular to Zelda. He wrote, illustrated, and designed a majority of the manual to A Link to the Past. He convinced Miyamoto to make Ocarina of Time in third person, helped develop the Z-targeting system, developed models for Link, Epona, and the 3D environments, all while serving as the game's 3D system director. He was also the game system director for Majora's Mask, and he was the assistant director on Wind Waker, a game whose story is still beloved. On his game design philosophy, he said, "If you think about games only as a thing that you interact with, you're missing the possibility of immersion. The inspirations that I tend to draw on for all that come from real life itself. Hiking on a mountain and seeing a cave and thinking about what's inside, it's that sense of wonder and excitement I want players to feel." Thank you for bringing such wonder to my favorite series, Koizumi-san.